It was just 5 years or 10 years ago that there was an ample dose of skepticism from investors about the viability of open source as a business model. But now we can safely say that IT industry is on a threshold of new open source era. And today we are with Dr. Brett Cameron, Chief Solution Officer. He's driving the strategy for OpenVMS application services and open source. And he is here today to tell us about open source in VMS Software. Hello, Brett.
Good morning, Igor. Well, good afternoon to you, sorry.
Firstly, can you tell our viewers a bit about yourself? How did you get into VMS Software? What is your work?
It's an interesting question. So where do I start? I suppose the simple answer is that when I finished university, I'd done a PhD in chemical physics, and I finished the PhD early in 1992, and I literally had no money. My scholarship had run out. All my sources of income from the government had run out, and essentially I needed a job. And my options were really kind of twofold. I mean, I could kind of try and look to find some postdoctoral research overseas, or I could try and find a job in my hometown, Christchurch, New Zealand. And as it happened, I noticed in the newspaper and the job advertisements, because in those days we had newspapers with job advertisements in them. And I noticed this job for a Fortran programmer with Digital Equipment Corporation. I thought, well, I know Fortran. I've been doing quite a lot of that for the past few years while I've been doing my PhD. And I applied for that job and I got it. So, that was kind of a miracle. I got the first job that I ever applied for. And so, as I say, that was around, February 1992. And the funny thing is, I kind of ended up just basically being stuck there. So we went from being digital to compact to HP. And we had a really great team. So the group I worked with down in Christchurch in the South Island of New Zealand, we focused on custom application development. So we would develop applications for government departments, telecommunications organisations, those sorts of things, based on their requirements. And originally with digital and to some degree with compact, we focused very much on developing applications for VMS customers. But as time went by and our group grew in size and so forth, we branched out and we started doing things with Microsoft and Unix and all sorts of other platforms as well, to be honest. So we were essentially just a custom software development shop based down the bottom of the world there, mostly servicing customers in Australia and New Zealand. But for whatever reason, I don't really know why, I started kind of interacting with or communicating with people elsewhere. I think I kind of realized early on that digital we had a global network in digital. This was quite an incredible thing. Okay, I'd come from university and we had actually had the internet there. But what I realized, I think, was that digital was this global organization and there were interesting people elsewhere in the world. And I kind of did what I could to get to know some of these people. And this kind of resulted, I think, in paving the way for a lot of what happened maybe from, say, the late 90s up until when I left HP, where I ended up traveling all around the world doing jobs for customers in the United States, in Europe, Middle East, and so forth. It was a very interesting time. I got to meet a lot of interesting people and made a lot of good friends and a lot of contacts. And it was those contacts kind of by accident. People know other people and contacts know other contacts. And I think it was late in 2011, I got a call out of the blue from someone in Seattle saying, "Hey, Brett, would you like to join the HP services, the HP Cloud Services team?" So this was kind of like, I thought, well, that's kind of neat. Moving from doing VMS development and things like that, all of a sudden joining the HP Cloud Services team. And that was kind of an offer I really couldn't refuse, and it was really quite a fascinating time being with cloud services for the best part of 3 or 4 years before then joining VSI. Unfortunately, I think the HP Cloud Services team, they kind of bit off a bit more than they could chew, perhaps, trying to take on the likes of Google and Amazon Instead of competing, maybe they should have tried to work more closely with those organizations, which is eventually what happened. But the net result was that the cloud services team kind of changed format a little bit, and it was probably quite a timely move on my part to join VSI. And kind of joining VSI was almost back to the future, back to the good old days of VMS again. It was a job I kind of couldn't refuse. And that came about largely through people like Sue Skanetsky and Eddie Orchid, whom I'd worked with obviously for many years in the OpenVMS community. And they were very, very keen to get me on board, for which I'm most appreciative. So that's kind of not overly short, but a bit of a story about how I came to end up in VSI. In terms of programming in general, where that started out really was, as I said earlier, was with the university doing my PhD, where I was building this thing called a supersonic molecular beam machine. I won't bore you with the details of what that is. But let's just say there's a lot of ultra high vacuum, a lot of interesting electronics and so forth, and a bit of chemistry and physics thrown in there as well. But when you're building these sorts of machines, things break often, or your ideas about the equipment you need and so forth prove to be incorrect. So there's a lot of downtime. There's a lot of time when you cannot be doing any experiment, stuff just isn't working and so on and so forth. So rather than sit there and read the newspaper, which really used to annoy my PhD supervisor, I decided that a better course of action was to try and simulate actually, how this machine was supposed to work. So I set about teaching myself Fortran, which seemed like the language of choice in those days for scientific computing. And I started writing Fortran code, I think, on a PC. I couldn't tell you what Fortran variant it was, but it was very slow. And my friend at the university, this was around 1988 sort of time frame, my best friend at university said, "Oh, Brett, the university has these things called VAXes." I thought, well, that sounds interesting. Tell me more. And so that's essentially how I started using VMS, was writing Fortran simulations, Monte Carlo simulations on the university VAXes. Yeah.
Okay. Nowadays, open source has become extremely popular, even in those companies which have always denied the benefits of open source products for business. Why is VMS Software involved in developing free software?
You kind of can't fight it, to be honest. I think even at an early stage of my career, in fact, while I was still doing my PhD, I started using Linux. I can recall installing Linux from, I think it was something like 21 3.5-inch floppy disks. And the great thing was that if you could be on the last disk and something would go wrong and the installation would fail and you were back to square one, So installing Linux in those days was a lot different to how you install it today, or spin up a virtual machine in cloud or something like that. But one way or another, I've been involved in open source and Linux almost as long as I've been involved in VMS. And I just think the whole concept is great. And certainly in the early days, there was open source software. Well, even today, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, there are clearly projects that you shouldn't touch with a barge pole. But there are other projects, and this is a key point that I've made to people sometimes quite vehemently in conference or in presentations, is that some of these people, many of these people who work on open source projects today are some of the best developers you will find on the planet. I mean, the quality of this software is second to none. It's well supported by a large community. It is well documented and it's well used. Some of the quality of these open source products easily rivals the commercial counterparts. So certainly I agree totally that there was resistance from some communities, I suppose, towards open source in the past, maybe government departments. I certainly recall in New Zealand were very reluctant to start using open source software. But once you started getting organizations like Red Hat that provided genuine quality 24/7, by 365 support and so forth for this stuff, I think things started to change, and you really couldn't fight it. And, with just other examples where you would have like stock exchanges looking at low latency trading systems. I mean, those guys will get software wherever they can if it's going to give them an advantage. But I think the key point is that overall, there's some really darn good software out there. This is great product. In many ways, the features equal to, if not better than, commercially available products. And like I said, some of the people who work on these products, some of whom are personal friends, are some of the best software engineers on the planet, without question. From a VMS perspective, well, VMS is obviously a proprietary operating system, and that in itself creates some challenges in terms of attracting young talent. It also creates challenges in terms of getting open source products onto OpenVMS, because there are differences. OpenVMS is not Linux, and it never will be. There are differences in the way certain things work. There are differences in the fundamental design principles of the operating system. But the bottom line is that, we want some of that good software on OpenVMS. I mean, it makes it useful. I spend a lot of my time traveling the globe, when with HP and to some degree with VMS Software, helping customers to modernize their application environments. If you've got some old application that was written 30 years ago in COBOL or Fortran or BASIC, and the boss comes to you and says, hey, I want to integrate this thing with this fancy new piece of software we've got running on Linux. How do we do that? Maybe you could go out and buy some commercial product, but to be honest, there's going to be an open source solution which is going to be just as good and probably going to end up costing you a lot less. So I think there are some significant cost benefits in open source and the use of open source, as long as it's supported, obviously, and as long as it's a good piece of software. I think there's also, as I said, the angle of attracting younger people to OpenVMS, so they don't log into this alien world. They can log into a world that has some of the same tools that they're used to, many of the same tools that they're used to finding on Linux or Windows or elsewhere. There are numerous benefits, yeah.
Are there any peculiarities of porting open source to OpenVMS?
Many. So, like I just said, there are VMS is not Linux. It's a proprietary operating system. It has some subtle differences, as indeed does Windows. It's a simple fact of life, and you really just cannot get around it. I mean, the most common ones, the most common area of difficulty is probably in the I/O space, whether that's network I/O or whether it's disk I/O or whatever. If you look at VMS, for example, you're familiar with RMS, the way in which files are stored on disk and things like that. I mean, on Linux, it's just a series of bytes. In the OpenVMS world, files can have a very definite and well-defined record structure and various other characteristics. These sorts of things can create quite a lot of complications. So there are those sorts of basic platform differences. Also, things like, for example, VMS doesn't support the Unix fork function. Now, hypothetically, it can, but to implement that, to be honest, we're going to have to go through a whole slice of the operating system, almost right down to driver level, all the way back up through the C runtime library. It's not to say we couldn't do it, but it's a lot of effort to do something like that. And again, to be honest, it kind of goes against the grain of some of the fundamental design principles of the operating system. So there are fundamental differences from an architectural perspective. There are also things, I think it's a little bit sad, but I think it's very fair to say that until we took over the operating system, things had been kind of left to rot a little bit. Things had not been maintained well or kept up to date in certain areas. And one of those things would be, for example, the C runtime library, where we have a significant list of issues with the C runtime library, be it missing functions, be it bugs or whatever. And to try and address that, we've now put in place a fairly active program of work around enhancing the C runtime library. In part, that's for open source, but also in part, it's for the port of OpenVMS to x86, where we need to have C99 compliance, for example, with the C runtime library. So there are a lot of things to overcome, but interestingly, most products can be ported, to be honest, and there are ways of working around all these issues. It's just kind of experience, I suppose, and degrees of difficulty. We've recently released OpenJDK. We've done new versions of Samba recently. I mean, something like Samba, for example, and that's just got to be one of the worst as far as I/O is concerned, right? I mean, you've got network I/O going on to copy files across the wire. Those files are stored on disk. You've got RMS attributes coming into play all over the place and so forth. It's as I say, probably one of the worst to be porting to OpenVMS, and we have that working. So these sorts of things are all possible. It's just a case of understanding what you need to change and so forth. Yeah.
Talking about you, what role does software development play in your non-work life? Do you personally contribute to open source projects, maybe listen to tech podcasts, or have fun side project you play around with?
It's an interesting question. I would say firstly that my work-life balance is not really very good. Um, I don't really contribute as much as I used to. Possibly when I was with HP, particularly in the cloud services team, I used to contribute a bit more in the open source space. My role within the cloud services team was around RabbitMQ, which is a message queuing product that basically provided the central nervous system for the OpenStack cloud environment, still does today. And I have some, for better or worse, some specialist skills in that area. And I used to contribute a little bit to that project and to some related bits and pieces. It's written in a language called Erlang, and I was involved in, well, still am involved in some of that. But I certainly don't do as much in that space as I used to. I suppose to some degree that's time. Been focusing on other things. I'm also not all that big when it comes to listening to things like podcasts and so forth. I don't know. I've never been a big fan of sticking on headphones and listening to stuff. You know, if I listen to music, I want to crank stereo up nice and loud, as opposed to hear it through headphones. But I do read a lot, obviously, online in terms of keeping up to date with latest developments and trends. And I'm probably also a little bit naughty in the respect that like I mentioned right at the start, you know, I'm very, very pleased with the group of friends and contacts that I have. And through them, you know, I mean, they work in diverse areas, could be anything from mainframe right through to leading edge startup type companies and so forth. So I get a lot of insights from my friends and so forth on what's going on and perhaps where I should be looking, and have discussions with them about things. And that helps me formulate some of my thinking on where we should be going and what we should be doing.
A few people know that you have a PhD in the area that is pretty far from your profession. That is fascinating. How do your doctorate in chemical physics help you at your current job? And talking about science, you know, open source software is doing something very similar to what science has been doing over the past couple of 100 years. That means that science, by its very nature, is mostly open source. You must share your science with other people so they can evaluate it. What do you think about it?
It's actually probably a very interesting way of looking at it, Igor, and perhaps I don't consciously think about it that way, but I'm wondering, having heard you say that, whether you are kind of quite right. You know, I know, for example, the sorts of things that annoy me greatly are the fact that we have to worry so much about security and all of this sort of nonsense. I mean, that's just so frustrating. You know, the idea of sharing stuff and for people having access to all of this goodness. I mean, that really does kind of sit quite well with me. So maybe there is kind of the subconscious thing going on there where, as you say, with the science aspect, I want to share information with others and so forth and collaborate. In terms of how having a PhD helps me, I don't know. I mean, obviously, the thing when you do a PhD, you learn a lot about a very specific area. I mentioned the supersonic molecular beam machine. I won't bore you with the experiments we were doing. They were fairly low-level, fundamental chemical physics experiments. But you become very specialised in that area, and you know an awful lot about it. In the IT industry, looking at my role these days, it's kind of the complete opposite of that, where I tend to know a little bit about a lot of things, and I wouldn't claim to be an expert in any of them, to be perfectly honest. But where I think maybe the PhD has helped is that when you do a PhD, I think you kind of learn how to learn. So it helps you, I think, to process information and understand information perhaps in a better way. That being said, you know, I don't have the most systematic approach to problem solving. I have a low boredom threshold, so you know, I'm sometimes not really what you would call particularly scientific in my approach to solving problems. Although I probably can be if I have to be, I'd just rather not. So I don't know. It's helped me in some kind of completely different ways as well. For example, if you're flying around the planet and so forth, which we're not really doing terribly much at the moment, I suppose, but certainly in the past, I used to put the doctor title on all my bookings and so forth, and this for some reason or other used to guarantee me a higher priority as far as getting upgrades were concerned, which was kind of quite nice. But I stopped doing that because, of course, they don't know whether you're a medical doctor or another sort of doctor. And if there's a medical emergency on the flight, then, you get tapped on the shoulder. I think it also helps in certain customer situations. For example, if I sit down with a customer who's maybe in the engineering sphere or something like that, I do tend to be perceived a little bit differently, rightly or wrongly, from the perspective that they will think that maybe I understand a bit more of what they're talking about. They can use scientific words and talk about, Helmholtz equations or whatever, and I basically understand what it is they're talking about. So that can be kind of useful. But to be honest, from a day-to-day perspective, I don't think it makes too much difference.
Turning to exactly what you are working on, how many projects do you currently have in your development?
Yeah, I I'll say I don't know. I mean, I know obviously what projects the teams are working on, which would only be really 5 or 6 projects, to be honest. And that's kind of maximum capacity for my team, I suppose. But you always get these little things that just come in from left field. A customer will say, hey, it would be really useful if we could have such and such a piece of open source software or something like that. And quite often I'll look at those and go, I could probably port that in a couple of hours or something. But the way in which we tend to approach it is, I'll maybe look 6 months or a year out, and we'll have, say, 3, 4, maybe 5 significant projects in flight at any point in time, focusing on particular large pieces of open source software. But then, as I say, in parallel with that, we'll probably get these little things that come in from time to time as well that we'll just try and slot in as best we can. But the big ones, obviously, we've just got OpenJDK out the door, which was a really great achievement by the team. Fantastic, the time frame in which they did that, and some really excellent work. Samba, that's been kind of an ongoing thing where we did the first version probably maybe about 18 months ago, and we've just been doing regular updates. They're probably 2 of the big ones. Other ones recently have been OpenLDAP, both client and server. We really needed to get a refresh of the LDAP client on OpenVMS. The old one was probably 10, 15 years old or something like that. So we were really desperate to get a new version of LDAP available for customers, which is great. We have an ongoing program of work, obviously, with OpenSSL. There's invariably some security fix or something or other that comes out, and there'll be a new version of OpenSSL from the openssl.org group. We like to get those available to customers as quickly as possible. We've then got several other projects in flight which aren't necessarily fully open source. There may be enhancements to lab products, things like WSIT, which is the Web Services Integration Toolkit. We're including additional language support and additional protocol support. So it'll work with the RabbitMQ message broker, for example. Working on a new version of TPware, which is the old gateway for interfacing with ACMS applications. Again, we're adding multiple language support. You'll be able to use TPware with Python, with Java, with PHP, and I think something else. And of course, there's the IDE extension that we've created for Microsoft Visual Studio Code, which I think is proved very, very successful. Very happy with that. And again, that's an ongoing program of work. So yeah, there's quite a lot going on, I guess. Probably a few more I've forgotten.
You have mentioned your team. How many people work with you, and what are these people responsible for?
Okay, so my team would probably be 20, 24 people if you include everybody from the QA project manager. I mean, that's one thing that I will say. Never ask me to manage something. I'm just dreadful at that. I can come up with crazy ideas for forever and a day, but I can't manage projects. So don't ask me to manage a project. So I would say probably around 24 people. And predominantly, as per the previous question, predominantly those people are working on open source projects of one form or another. Some I didn't mention there around MariaDB and Python, for example, could be added to the list. But most of them are open source products, yeah. And that will continue. We're looking to grow that team just slightly, and we'll probably supplement some of the open source activity with some x86 work around getting some of the layered products ported across to OpenVMS. There's a reasonable amount of work to be done in porting those products, and the open source team, with their knowledge and expertise, are very well placed to assist with that. But the main focus, as I say, is definitely open source.
Okay. If you look in the near future, or maybe a bit more distant future, on which project do you see your team working? What do you want to achieve?
Yeah, probably. To be perfectly honest, well, there's a couple of things there. I mean, the first thing is probably more of the same. Okay, so I've talked about a lot of products in the past 2 or 3 questions there. So it will be more of the same. I mean, obviously there are things like OpenSSL, which will just keep evolving, and the OpenSSL group will be releasing SSL 3.0 in the not too distant future. So that's a slightly big jump. And coupled with that will be FIPS 140-2 compliance related work, which is important, particularly to United States-based customers, or some of them at least. So there's an ongoing program of work there, ongoing program of work around the IDE. Once we have C++ compiler available for x86, we'll obviously be looking at OpenJDK, which will be a very big chunk of work. There are probably 2 or 3 other projects that I probably really can't say too much about, but I think that they will be of considerable interest to the community, and we should know a bit more soon. A couple of other things that aren't really so much open source that we're working on. One of them would be the web UI, which is essentially I would say a web-based interface to a number of OpenVMS features and functions, but it's kind of more than that. It does have a nice, sexy browser-based user interface, but it also has a RESTful API. So, for example, you could write a little Python script and run that on your Windows or Linux system to actually do an administrative task on VMS, like adding a user or deleting a user, or checking up on a particular process, or anything like that. So we're really quite enthusiastic about the web UI, and we should look to make that available, hopefully before the end of summer, a first initial release. One of the motivations behind that actually was, as we move forward with x86 and we start looking at virtualizing the operating system a lot more and getting into a cloud-like environment and so forth, having these sorts of tools and facilities makes quite a big difference. So, as I say, that's a product we're quite enthusiastic about. Another one that probably we need to increase focus on a little bit is the services portal. So the idea here is that this would work with Dave Sweeney, head of our support team. This would work with Dave's team to provide services to our supported customers. For example, the ability to upload T4 performance files and analyze them, in a web browser using functionality provided by the portal. Or they could ask us to analyze those files on their behalf and so forth, same with system health check. The portal also includes quite a nice package management facility, so you don't have to go hunting around for kits and so forth. You just say, I want to install OpenJDK, and that will magically happen for you, a little bit like Windows and Linux. I'm oversimplifying, but you get the idea. So yeah, there's a lot going on, and I think probably there are a few other ideas, new projects that won't start this year, maybe next year. But a big thing here, sorry to go on, Igor, but a big thing here is probably around, once we're on x86 with the LLVM-based compiler backend, that opens up some very interesting possibilities for us, because obviously we're taking across the programming languages, C, C++, Fortran, COBOL, Pascal, etc. But there are other LLVM-based languages out there like Rust and Google's Golang and things like that. once we're on x86, we can actually start having some serious fun with some of this stuff, right? That's not going to be happening this year. We should start to get the native compilers onto x86, maybe later this year, but definitely next year. So I think there will be some interesting projects starting to develop. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Brad. It was very interesting. I believe this will help people who are interested in what VMS software does to know a little bit more.
Okay.